Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramazan, and today we continue our conversation with historian, author, columnist, and national treasure Angelo Bissessarsingh. Angelo, thanks for sticking around. I'm just so honored that you're here, knowing that what you're going through, and
Thank you.
the fact that you drag yourself from Safari in between a medical appointment to be here. Let's talk about virtual glimpses into the past. It follows on the heels of your other works. I still treasure the cemeteries book so much. I have this thing about cemeteries, and I understand that
I'm glad.
as a child, had a thing about cemeteries as well, even.
Really?
Well, your aunt was telling me that you enjoyed it as a kid.
Oh, yes, you
wandering
heard
around
that story.
cemeteries.
Yeah, actually, when kids wanted to go to the amusement park or the pool or the mall, I would go to a cemetery.
People don't understand the joys of being in a cemetery, do they?
No, and they didn't understand the connection. Because, for instance, in the 19th century, when you read an epitaph on a tombstone, it tells you the entire life of the person. It's not like now where they will put John Doe, born so-so-so, died so-so-so.
Mm-hmm.
No, they were very, very detailed.
And even if in La Perouse, for example, you'll see where people died as a typhoid epidemic.
And they will tell you
that
what
there
they
was a
died from.
shipwreck. You're seeing the
Yes.
thing. All these fascinating things.
And they tell you the parents' name, who they were married to, how many kids they had.
Yeah, and if you go to Mukarapo Cemetery, there's a Jewish section, which is
Yeah.
especially fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you see people who actually left Jerusalem,
That's right.
ended up coming here and dying
And
here.
actually, before that cemetery was established, the couple of prominent Jews who died in Trinidad, because there was no consecrated Jewish cemetery, they had to be buried at sea.
Really?
Yeah. Ernest Canning was one of them, founder of the Canning's Empire.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Wow. How do you pick, I mean, when we look through this book, speaking of glimpses, it really is glimpses in the past, because you're very strong on visuals.
Very much so.
So every page has some sort of fascinating picture, and I don't want to damage the book because it's going to be a valuable treasure I'll hold for years to come and probably pass down. But it's just fascinating pictures that obviously you've collected over time, or managed to source over the years.
Yeah, that's right.
How do you pick the topics that you cover? Because you cover from obviously big, magnificent national landmarks to the minutiae of normal life.
If it has an interesting story, it's worth telling.
And how do you determine these interesting stories?
Well, it's like I hear a million stories every day now since I've become nationally known as a researcher and a storyteller and a writer. People call me, text me, or email me all the time, but they're stories. And you will hear a million times the same story over and over and over again. But in that million stories, you will hear the one that is truly fascinating and is truly worth following up. Like, I'll give you an example. Especially when you're dealing with helping people trace their Indo-Trinidadian ancestry, right? Remember, a lot of the names were changed on registry at Nelson's Island, especially since the registrars, in any case, the British registrars, they were illiterate. They didn't talk in any of the Indian languages, Bhojpuri, Hindi, Urdu, anything like that. And the translators used to be some scamps as well.
So they would hear some name and just figure, well, it sounds like, and
Exactly.
write it down as that.
So, they would have a story that doesn't add up, right? And I hate to put it like this. There was one particular line of research I was working with some very noteworthy researchers. And what we noticed is that among the ancestors of these people, probably going back 1, 2, maybe 3 generations, light-skinned Indians started to appear. Light-skinned, brown hair, gray eyes.
I wonder where that came from.
Right? And how they would explain it is that I had a grandfather who was from Kashmir.
There's a lot of that Kashmir story going around. I've noticed a lot of my friends will say,
Yeah.
mention Kashmir. And I'll be telling them I'm pretty sure there was no major Kashmiri
And
migration to Trinidad.
They didn't want to hear that it was a Scots or an Irish overseer who passed there.
So that they'd rather build up a mythological history
Exactly. So it
as
becomes
opposed to the real history.
Yeah, it becomes distorted.
Do you find a lot of times that people will tell a story, you might hear it repeated multiple times about a place or about something that happened in Trinidad and Tobago, and then when you actually start to research, it's not
Yes.
that at all?
Like, for instance, there is a stone building, or at least part of one, on South Quay, just opposite City Gate, right? And I remember a social studies textbook that I use in Standard 5 describing it as a slave cell. What I've realized is that every building that is built out of stone and has iron bars in it was built to jail slaves. It's as simple as that. Nobody cares to look at the history. The actual history of that is very much after the end of slavery. that it was a vault, a strong box, so to speak, built for a large hotel that stood on the spot, and the owner of the hotel used to keep his cash and receivables in that.
Well, that's not quite as glamorous, is it?
No, and people make up stories all the time. It's like, for instance, I went looking for a particular building, and I came across a modern house, probably built in the 1950s from San Fernando gravel, right? And these people were trying to convince me that it's nearly 200 years old.
Because I guess it fits a romantic narrative we have of our own
Yeah.
lives and our family histories.
Yeah,
isn't
that's
it?
right.
Well, we're both kind of connected to South, obviously. You're deeper South even. But there's stories that Southerners tell that I always found sort of interesting because you hear them over and over and over again. Let's
Yeah.
pick one, for example, the Claxton Bay headless statue.
Right.
That's an interesting one because we
Yes.
all grew up hearing that story.
Yeah.
Nobody I knew ever actually saw it.
Yeah.
But you heard the story about the girl crossing the highway at night, and even though there wasn't really a highway there before, but never mind that. And then when you actually research it, there actually is some basis for that particular story.
Well,
But I always thought it was something my dad made up, for example.
no, actually, this story is going to be told. I'm jumping ahead a little here in an upcoming book that I'm doing on local ghost stories and folklore, which hopefully will be launched early next year. That statue stands on that hill, but I'm not sure if it's a tombstone. I'm not sure if it's a religious devotional statue. But the story that was touted is that Mr. Farmer, who was the overseer of Forest Park Estate, had a daughter. And there's a little spicy part thrown in where the daughter had a rendezvous with some Indian boy or something like that.
And then there was a snake.
And there was a snake, and the snake bit her, and she died. And the grieving father buried her on the hill. I went up there with Otto Carrington from CNC3, and it really looks like a French devotional statue of the Virgin Mary or something like
Well,
that.
that's just going to ruin everything, all these years of that story we've been
Yes,
told.
but I am not going to be the one to ruin it. So in my upcoming book on
You put it in the
mythology
book
and
that's
folklore,
assigned to folklore and ghost
that's
stories.
right. It's going to remain a ghost story.
The fact that you actually, that particular upcoming book fascinates me a little bit. I don't want to jump ahead of this one because, again, launching Thursday at Gulf City, Nigel
At 7
Khan.
p.m.
7 p.m. If anything like the last one, I wasn't able to make it there because of car issues, but it was packed.
Yeah.
But the fact that you've separated out folklore and ghost stories, because it must be difficult because quite often Trinidad history is inextricably tied in with folklore and ghost stories.
Yeah.
But you've chosen to keep the magic by putting it as a separate.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is that you have the wholesale characteristics of folklore, which would include Papaboa, Sukunya, Larger Bless,
Mama Glow,
Twins,
yeah.
Mama Glow, that sort of thing. And then you would hear the ghost stories. The ghost stories are the individual ones that really are told in villages or told around a lamp when the light goes out or something like that. And I try to record them side by side.
The folklore of Trinidad and Tobago is fascinating in itself, isn't it?
Dreadfully so.
And it's such a mixture of European mixed in with African.
Very much so.
And I guess there must be some Indian influence there
Some
as well.
influences, yeah.
But not as much, I imagine, is there?
Not very, very much, no.
Would that be because the Indians sort of came and found themselves in the middle of an already well-established culture of mythology?
And you know, as much as people might not admit it or choose to ignore it, Indians integrated pretty well. You know, so Indians believed as much in Obia as their Afro-Trinidadian forebears. So really and truly, it became a hodgepodge of cultures that created the folklore.
And it's all a wonderful, colourful soup that's worth telling.
Very much so.
I think Stuart Hand had done some beautiful illustrations
Yeah.
of some of the folklore characters that I think are worth watching if people haven't seen them before. But talk about some of the stories contained within
Well,
Virtual Glimpses.
This is very diverse. One of the stories, for instance, is of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. People wonder why I wrote that one into this book and not the Holy Trinity Cathedral. Because I was inspired by the valiant efforts that the Catholic community made to preserve their cathedral. And why I was even more inspired was when I saw that the Scots Presbyterian Church in Trinidad was willing to let Greyfriars fall, and they were willing to sell it, and they were willing to let a developer trample over their heritage and their sacred site, while the Catholics were fighting tooth and nail to preserve theirs.
And if people weren't following the story, the cathedral, as we're looking at it now, there was a serious problem, and they're still working on it, I gather.
Yes.
the basement was flooded. Well, I'm not sure if it's actually an actual basement, but the lower levels of the cathedral were flooded, and it was causing serious damage.
Very much so.
And it was going to cost millions, and everybody
Has cost millions.
has cost millions, and then people rallied
Yeah.
around to preserve one of the most beautiful buildings in Port of Spain.
Yeah, and it was a myriad of structural problems they were contending with, but they dealt with them. And it really showed a lot of devotion to one particular cause. So that's why the cathedral is in there, and not Holy Trinity, which still has a way to go. For instance, I tell the story of Cobo Town, right? Cobo Town is somewhere that doesn't exist in Port of Spain anymore, but it's the lower part of Sackville Street up to where Wrights Road ended, that area around the Radisson, formerly Holiday Inn. That produced a lot of very influential and very noteworthy Trinidadians, not the least of which is Jackie Hinkson, the artist. So it's a community that vanished, that was swallowed up by the city, and it was a very colorful place. So I thought I would tell that story, and then somewhere on the right side of things, I thought I'd tell this story about donkeys, right? One of my earliest memories is my paternal grandfather and I driving through on a rainy day through Carapal in Erin, which was cocoa. It was cocoa and coffee, and a lot of the people spoke Spanish as a first language. And stopping on the side of the road where a guy had about 7 little donkeys coming out of the bush, and they had these baskets of cocoa on their backs. And my grandfather speaking to this man in fluent Spanish, and he stopped the donkeys and let me pet them. So it was a vivid memory for me. How many children could say they did something like that? The donkey has become practically extinct in Trinidad, and people always associate donkeys with being stubborn and recalcitrant and whatnot. Oh, they were extremely hardworking, and they were tractable animals provided you know how to manage them. So the donkeys became part of that story. And then there is a story there called Bring Out the Ham, right? Because, I mean, provided you're not Islamic or Jewish, what Trini Christmas is complete without a ham, right? And it tells the story about the different types of hams, the qualities, you know. There's a part of it in which I refer disparagingly to people who pretend to be paranderos just to take part to take apart your ham and your grub. But it's been a wonderful experience compiling this book and its predecessor. And I hope that it's easy enough to read that people of varying ages can enjoy it. People who are pre-secondary school, people who are retired, and it coughs up a memory for them. That is really my wish for this book.
It's remarkable to me how this nation has changed and why it's important that we have someone like you preserving some of these things that we may forget so quickly unless they're actually put down in writing. Because, I mean, you're not even fully 34 yet. You would have been on Thursday.
Exactly.
And you're remembering Spanish as a first language and donkeys.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're mentioning ham there. I don't remember the last time I saw a childhood ham which involved a pitch oil tin.
Exactly.
And boiling and boiling and boiling the heck out of it to get the tar off of the outside. So things have changed so much that we've lost a connection to things.
Yeah, and there are people who struggle to renew that connection. Like, for instance, Charles Kongsu, who's a Guardian journalist and a good friend of mine. He went on this epic trek 2 Christmases ago to find where they were selling salt and pitch hams still in Trinidad, and he found it in a Chinese grocery on Charlotte Street. So there are people who are trying still to make the connection.
Let's talk about the influence you've had on the diaspora. Your books are so much in demand. I'm not making this up, people. This is true. You actually literally, people are buying them faster than you can print them.
Literally faster.
And so therefore I'm honored to have the first off the press, by the way. Thank you for
First
that.
off the press.
You have people from all over the world trying to organize to get a copy of the book.
Yeah, that's right.
That must be deeply touching to somebody in Amsterdam or Japan or wherever saying,
Yes,
listen, how do I get a copy?
Actually, when I started the virtual museum project, I had a fan on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica,
Really?
Yeah,
I must have missed that one.
that was incredible. Do you see, the book is not just about history, it's about memories, It's about looking at those pictures and seeing your own life in sepia tones. And that is why these books are important. Because I could go in any academic history book can tell you about the statistics of slavery or the statistics of indentureship, and it won't mean a thing. But if I told you a story related to one of those long trials, it becomes totally connected to your experience. And that's why the diaspora has reached out, and the diaspora has been very supportive of what I am doing. Because there are many trainees abroad who had to leave, you know. Let's face it, the Caribbean is always about looking outwards. And they want to recapture something that they forgot or something that they missed out on. And I am glad that they are finding it through these books.
I'm not sure, but I know there are some other people who've written sort of more novel type things, but in terms of pure history, but written as if it's living,
Yeah.
you're sort of you've touched a nerve with people, because we've had a lot of wonderful historical books. I mean, Professor Burton and others
very much so,
amazing.
very much so.
My late Auntie Marianne, of course, worked in history as well. But you brought it to life, and that really, as you mentioned, that gets people going.
Yeah, and I'll tell you
Because it's not a
this
chore
much.
anymore, it's a joy.
The people who wrote our history first, Professor Burton, Professor Samaru, your own late aunt Marianne Ramessa, Anthony Devatile, Michael Anthony, and Gerard Besson, among others. Their work has been the foundation on which I stood. So I would not be anything if not for them.
But you write in a different way.
I just have a narrative writing style, that's all.
Well, no, you bring it to life. Would it be fair to say, because I mean, we've been talking about history this and history that, but what really is history? I mean, I always think perhaps history is memories curated by someone. Would that be a fair assessment? It's what you choose to see as a historian?
It's an aspect of history, but for me, history really is your story. Because your story does not simply exist within your lifetime. Your lifetime is that chapter in a story that started way before you were born, and it will continue way after you're dead. You know, so that is what it has been for me. That I know my ancestry going back several hundred years, and that my life threatens to be very short. It might just be a couple months down the road again. But the reality is that my demise is not going to cut that story at anywhere along the road. There will be people to carry on, and there will be people who will take up where I have left off. As I have always told my fans, that I have had a short life, and I have done what I could do. But the story is theirs to perpetuate now. They have to go and find out their own sagas, preserve them, write them, research them, share them with their children. Not everybody is going to be able to produce a book like this. I mean, as I said in the last interview, I was very fortunate to have friends. I was very fortunate to have a publisher like Queen Bishop Publishing to produce a book like this. But a simple thing as writing down the history of your family and preserving that for posterity, that is priceless, even if you never see it in print, because it preserves the story.
It would be nice if more trainees didn't think that history began in 1962, wouldn't it?
God, yeah. Reality is that in the years that I've been doing this and in the years that I've been sharing my experience with other people, is that you see how much was lost simply because people had no knowledge of the past and no reason to cherish the past. I mean, for instance, I was researching this once very powerful family down in Citrus. Their old house still exists. They have this huge tombstone in the cemetery, and I asked them if they had any photo albums of their ancestors. And the guy looks at me, and he's not being arrogant or anything like that, very nice fellow. Yeah, well, we had it, but I throw it away and burn it.
Wow. It's sort of sad that we just think everything in the past is the past, and therefore
Not
it's
important.
worth nothing. Yeah.
Exactly.
You're basically throwing away part of yourself.
Yeah. And you're throwing away something that cannot be retrieved.
And my friend Nuro, who's involved in now trying to catalogue and archive some of this actual history that people don't think is history, but it is history,
Right.
is painfully aware of the fact that people just leave things in drawers, they end up in dumpsters, they end up in
Yes.
the labas, and that's the end of that. And
Yes. Like, for instance, the demolition of Greyfriars is
yeah,
probably...
let's talk about that. You mentioned that before.
Yeah.
And to me, that was a seminal moment in our contempt
Yes,
for history.
very much so. And then a couple of weeks ago, the demolition of Beryl
Well,
McBurney's
McBurney's
house.
home, yeah.
You see, that demolition, the McBurney house, why there is no excuse for that is one, she built a little Carib which she had founded and which she poured all her energies, all her life. And then when the house was demolished, artifacts, pictures, documents were still inside. So nobody cared to go into that house and take them out. Nobody cared.
A woman of that importance.
Yeah. So there's no excuse for what went on there.
I also found, I mentioned this to Noura when she was on recently, I thought the argument when somebody said the house is of no architectural significance, I found that rather troubling because to me, yes, architectural significance is nice, president's house, etc., but there's such a thing as historical significance.
That's right.
It could be a ramshackle anything,
Yes.
but if it has some piece of our history, a
Yes.
part of us in it,
Exactly.
it's important.
The log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born is still preserved in the United States. It's a shack. You know, a skilled craftsman could build one of that in probably about 3 to 4 hours. But it is the birthplace of an American president. And they dismantle that and they take immense care of it. So it's, again, not of architectural merit is not an excuse.
I think the US is a good example of how history and the way you treat history and the way you tweak history can make a nation. A lot of the US history is mythology, really.
Very
It's
much
an
so.
imagined history. It's the George Washington, the cherry tree kind of history.
Very much so, yeah.
But it feeds into their national consciousness.
Yeah.
We don't really pay much regard to all our precedents and people who, our ancestors, if you will, who
No.
led us to where we are today.
No,
We don't mythologize them. We don't care about them.
we don't care, we forget. We forget. For instance, you ask any school child today who was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, they look at you with a blank stare. They just don't know because nobody taught them and nobody is teaching them to appreciate it.
Well, thank God we have people like you who are making something that is accessible. And I can actually see a parent reading this to their kids.
Yeah,
You know, family
That's
family
why-
time, sit around reading, learn about the history of your neighborhood or some other
Yeah.
neighborhood you haven't been to before.
actually, that is my fervent wish that parents sit down, take off the TV, take off the tablet, and read to their kids. Because, as I said, my foundation as a writer began there. People reading to me.
We have maybe 3 or 4 minutes left, Angelo. The next few months are going to be interesting for you, aren't they? I mean,
Very, very tough.
troubling and interesting and tough.
Yeah. It's already very hard right now because my illness has progressed to such a state that it has deprived me of most of my mobility. It has deprived me of basic nutrition that I knew. It is very, very painful. I live on painkillers, and it's very questionable that my treatment could have any further effect on the disease. You know, the chemotherapy that I'm taking right now.
And the best you're hoping for is a little extra time, right? And maybe a little less pain.
A few months, yeah. Actually, I have done what I set out to do, and I will continue writing until my hands freeze up, you know, and until that time, I just wait to see what happens.
In years to come, when people talk of Angelo Bissessarsingh, and as the movie says, and they will, what do you want people to think of when they think of you?
Simply as a doodler, not as no great historian or a great writer or anything like that, but somebody who saw a void and tried to fill it. That was all.
And the sad part is, because of the history that you bring alive, and I've known you a little while now, we've only met a few times really, but I think people may tend to forget that you're also one of the most decent people and one of the most fun people I've ever met. You're completely irreverent, you're full of quirks.
Very much so.
You collect weapons.
Yes.
And I should mention things like knives, by the way,
Non-firing
not the firing
weapons,
ones.
yeah.
And people may lose track of the fact that you are a real human being with real human feelings and real personality who I've never heard anybody say a bad word about.
Well, when I started the virtual museum project, people didn't know that there was an Angelo Bissessarsingh behind it, right? And I remember my first public appearance afterwards, and people thought that I was a virtual presence. They didn't realize
I
it
thought
was
you were like an
somebody
avatar that appeared.
Yes, yes. They had taken it for granted that I existed only on the internet, you know. So, and I remember this one encounter in a mall where I heard somebody talking about the virtual museum project, and I turned around and I said, "Thank you," right?
Mm.
She said, "What you thanking me for?" I said, "That you like the virtual museum." She said, "And what that has to do with you?" I said, "Well, that's my project, you know. I don't know how they thought it was happening, but For a long time, I was in the background of it.
Well, you've left a real legacy, Angelo Bissessarsingh. We're out of time. I just really can't thank you enough for what you've done for the country, for our appreciation of our own history, and for bringing so much joy into the lives of so many people. You are really, really a national treasure. I thank you so much for being here, Angelo.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. You've been watching 1 in 1. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.